Good evening. In this episode of our historical sketches, I will attempt to describe the events, the saga, and some of the twists and developments of a crucial period of European history affecting England and France in particular, but really affecting all of Europe. There are important and distinctive reasons that make the War of the Roses a historical milepost, but first of all, let us clarify one point. The War of the Roses is one of the final chapters of the much longer war referred to as the 100-Year War that ran actually from 1327 to 1453. The War of the Roses itself ran from 1455, year of the Battle of St. Albans, to 1487, year of the Battle of Stoke. The reasons why the classification War of the Roses rings more bells than the 100-Year War has to do with William Shakespeare, who dedicated a full cycle of plays to key characters and developments of the 100-Year War, some associated with the Red Rose of the House of Lancaster, and some with the White Rose of the House of York. Therefore, even those not necessarily interested in history know of the 100-Year War through some of the unforgettable characters and famous lines that they utter in the various plays. I can just refer to King Richard II, King Henry IV Bolingbroke, King Henry V, King Henry VI, King Richard III, just to name a few. To attempt to condense over 100 years of a history full of literally hundreds of characters, each interesting in himself or herself for their goodness or the perfidy, for their courage or their cowardice, their averageness or their exceptionality, is an impossible task. As I am putting this together, I do not even know how I can condense the whole in a way that can make sense. What I hope to achieve is to concentrate on a few characters and, with the help of Shakespeare, to place them in the appropriate context of this long war. And secondly, I will emphasize the relationships between this war and the changes that the war triggered across Europe, especially how it brought about, along with the improvements in armaments and warfare, how it brought about the transition from feudalism to the centralized state. Also, at the end of the 100-Year War, England ceased to be involved in the continent and went on her own maritime way, if we can say so, leaving France to be the continental power par excellence, so to speak, at least for a few centuries, along with Spain. Though Spain became quickly a contender with England for maritime supremacy and extended the use of Spanish to a good portion of the New World, of course South and Central America respectively, but also Africa, Asia, as far as the Philippines. And how the political, administrative problems that this transition from feudalism to the centralized state gave rise to, or at least how it was one of the causes that triggered the separation of the Church of England from the Church of Rome, not much later after the end of the 100-Year War. Of course, on all these issues there are as many interpretations as there are historians, and obviously all historians base their interpretation only on what other preceding historians said about the same event and the same characters. There is not, as yet, a time machine enabling us to watch in person, of course, the unfolding of the events. It is important to recognize that when Shakespeare wrote his plays, he was already steeped in the nationalistic spirit associated with centralized states such as England, France, Spain, etc. Therefore, his interpretation of events and people is influenced by a point of view that was not yet established when the 100-Year War and the War of the Roses took place. With these preambles in mind, let's begin. We could say that all the trouble began with William the Conqueror when he decided to invade England from Normandy in 1066 AD, of which Normandy he was the Duke. At that point, Norman power was established on both sides of the Channel. However, the English kings found themselves in a somewhat anomalous position, because on the one hand they were sovereigns of England, but at the same time, as Dukes of Normandy, they were vassals of the kings of France. As such, they were to be obedient to their feudal king of France or risk the forfeiture of their domains in Normandy. In the meantime, the continental, or if you like, the French possession of the Norman rulers, now also kings of England, kept increasing. And then with marriages of English kings and French feudal ladies, matters became even more complicated. In 1154, Henry II Plantagenet became king. By the way, Plantagenet is another name for the yellow broom flower and referred originally to a French dynasty. Henry II was by birth half English and half French. Through marriage, Henry II acquired vast possessions in France, in particular the dukedom of Aquitaine and Poitou. But then the King of France, Philip II Augustus for the record, 1180-1223, succeeded in subtracting the French domains from the English king. The next English king, Henry III, regained the lost lands, but King Louis IX of France defeated him at the Battle of Tailleberg in 1259. By the way, King Louis IX of France was canonized by the Catholic Church and is known as King Louis the Saint. In fact, to bring in a local note, St. Louis, Missouri is named after King Louis IX of France, in case you may wonder. Things were more or less quiet until 1337, the year of the beginning of the 100-Year War. What happened? Skipping a number of intermediate French kings, the last of the intermediates died without issue, and the assembly of the noble Frenchmen elected Philip of Valois, also called Philip the Lucky. As an aside, to show how history, folklore, and literature are interconnected, this Philip of Valois was the nephew of another French king, Philip IV, who got into disagreement with the Pope of the time, called Boniface VIII. In Italian history, the French king is notorious for having allegedly slapped Pope Boniface in the face in the Pope's palace near Rome in the city of Anagni. Pope Boniface VIII was allegedly corrupt, and Dante, who can be considered the Shakespeare of Italy, through a literary trick, places Boniface in hell even before the Pope died. And for the Catholics among this audience, Pope Boniface VIII was also the one who started the tradition of the Holy Year every 25 years in 1300 AD. Back to France. The decision of the grandees of France to elect this new Philip upset King Edward III Windsor, who was also the nephew of King Philip IV, the one who slapped the Pope, and Edward had also some reasonable ground to be elected King of France. As usual, there were other causes involved, and if that historical event were played on today's stage, there would be many that would call the other causes a conspiracy theory. Nevertheless, one cause was the alliance of Scotland with France, to which I've dedicated a previous video. The other reason was the French influence on the Flemish cities, with which England had a flourishing business exporting wool. Now, in England, the urban merchants, who feared the loss of their market, using facts or maybe lies well steeled in weighty arguments, as Shakespeare would say, convinced Edward III that he was the legitimate king of France and that the current king of France was a usurper. And this, in 1337, is the beginning of the 100-Year War. There followed a number of battles, the most famous of which was the Battle of Crécy in 1346, won by the English. Famous also from the military point of view, it was famous for the proven superiority of the long bow used by the English, whereas the French army, though more numerous, was based on the use of heavy cavalry. After one more battle won by the English at Poitiers, 10 years later, England reacquired most of the possessions in France. And now France fell into disorder. In Paris, the merchants rebelled because they felt that the king favored the nobility more than the merchants. But there were rebellions in the French countryside as well. One noteworthy was the so-called Jacquerie, name probably derived from the name of Jacques Bonhomme, a disparaging term applied to farmers at the time, which was caused by fiscal pressure and by the destructions caused by the mercenary troops that had lost a job after the end of the war with England and who were roaming and pillaging the countryside. The rebellion of the Jacquerie coalesced with another French rebellion caused by the independent workers of Paris. There was yet another rebellion under the leadership of a butcher in Paris called Caboche against the exorbitant taxes, and as well an effort by the king to establish a military conscription. About 20,000 people were killed in these revolts. Historians refer to these social upheavals as rebellions and not revolutions, because they did not have a well-defined social or political program as the revolutions of the 18th and 19th century in France. And I have not mentioned all the French rebellions so as to leave some room for the rebellions in England. Where? In 1381 and 1450 there were two rebellions repressed in blood as well. The first was led by Wat Tyler, started in Essex and in Kent, and almost threatened London. Triggering the rebellion was a new steep tax to finance the war against France, but the ideological inspiration were the theories of the theologian John Wycliffe, whom we can perhaps call an English Luther before Luther's times, though an heretic, Huss, would probably be a better comparison. As Luther and as Huss, Wycliffe proclaimed the superiority of the Bible over the words of the Pope. But this rebellion as well was put down and Wat Tyler executed. Another rebellion was led by John Cade, and this is dealt by Shakespeare, who portrays John Cade as a self-absorbed, ignorant peasant who was preaching a Bolshevik type of equality, as we find in his proclamation found in Shakespeare. And here, setting upon London stone, I charge and command that, of the city's cost, the pissing conduit run nothing but claret wine this first year of our reign. Actually, the Jack Cade rebellion had some of the same causes that triggered similar rebellions in France. More and more soldiers were returning from the war with France in England and could not easily be reinserted into civilian life. They almost captured King Henry VI, and it was the Archbishop of Canterbury who persuaded them to desist. Eventually John Cade was captured and executed anyway. On balance, we can say that though the 100-year war is remembered as a conflict between the rising French and English interests coalesced around the figure of their respective kings, there were also other forces at play, and the beginning of a social conscience among what we today would call the underclasses. But let's go back to the war. In 1399, a parliamentary conspiracy forced King Richard II to abdicate with the help of the powerful family of the Percys. Succeeding Richard II was his cousin Henry IV, the first king from a second line, that is, a cadet branch of the Plantagenets, where cadet refers to the line of a family that does not derive from the firstborn. Richard II was killed the next year in the castle of Pontefract, an episode around which Shakespeare has given us some of the most memorable lines among his most memorable lines. For example, in an admirable piece of anti-Richard II propaganda, the elderly John of Gaunt deplores the state of England under Richard II with these famous lines: "England, bound in with the triumphant sea, whose rocky shore beats back the envious siege of watery Neptune, is now bound in with shame, with inky blots, and rotten parchment bonds. And when, after a coup d'etat, a kind of color revolution similar to that in Ukraine in 2014, but before its times, when Richard II is deposed, he bitterly comments, "Of comfort no man speak. Let's talk of graves, of worms and epitaphs, make dust our paper, and with rainy eyes write sorrow on the bosom of the earth." And when prisoner in the castle of Pontefract, listening to some music coming from the outside and predicting his own imminent execution, he says, "How sour sweet music is when time is broke and no proportion kept. So is it in the music of men's lives." Back to the 100-Year War and their endless mass of intrigues. Henry IV Plantagenet had to overcome a rebellion by the same family that helped him to the throne. And his son Henry V distinguished himself in defeating the rebel forces. During his first youth, Henry V had associated with the caricature character type called Falstaff, an inspirational source of histories, comedies, and even operas. Falstaff loved wine and debauchery, and his soliloquy in praise of liquor is also an indirect indictment of what alcohol can do on addicts or to addicts. A good sherry sack had a twofold operation in it. It ascends me into the brain, drives me there all the foolish and dull and curdly vapours which environ it, makes it apprehensive, quick, fugitive, full of nimble, fiery and delectable shapes, which, delivered over to the voice, the tongue, which is the birth, becomes excellent wit. I will leave it to the viewer to find out for themselves, or for himself or themselves, what is the second property of an excellent sherry. Anyway, in the context of the 100-Year War, Falstaff, companion of the youthful and exuberant Henry, exits from the scene. And now Henry V, the king, prepares to repossess again the lands lost in France. In the play there is a long but interesting presentation by some priests who give Henry a kind of legal justification as to why he is the rightful owner of much of France. In actuality, the Archbishop of Canterbury, possibly fearful that the church be taxed, offered another solution for the ever-recurring economic puzzles. If we wish to make a parallel with current history, today it is even worse. Henry V rallied on the word of the priests to justify a French invasion. To invade and destroy Iraq with 1 million Iraqis and 5,000 Americans dead, plus countless wounded and crippled, all the US establishment needed was a vial of milk branded as chemical poison in the United Nations, plus the notoriously inexistent weapons of mass destruction. Anyway, Henry V landed in France and defeated the French in the famous Battle of Agincourt on October 25, 1415, where again, as it happened at Crécy in 1346, the French were superior in number but inferior in tactics. Eventually, Henry V conquered the city of Rouen and imposed his dynastic rights over most of today's France. And with the ensuing Treaty of Troyes, the French King Charles VI nominated actually Henry V his successor, disinheriting the French successor also named Charles. Furthermore, Charles V gave his daughter in marriage to Henry V. But, as Shakespeare himself would say, the web of life is of a mingled yarn. Good and ill go together. Our virtues would be proud if our faults whipped us not, and our crimes would despair if they were not cherished by our virtue. Henry VI, son of Henry V, suffered from an apparently inherited mental weakness, though throughout the 3 plays that bear his name he is portrayed as weak but not mere mentally incapacitated. In fact, he is the speaker of many memorable lines. To quote just one as an example, after being deposed by Edward of York, 2 of his guards take Henry VI prisoner, change sides, hoping to get a reward by delivering Henry V to the usurper. Henry comments on the general unreliability of people who behave like leaves pushed by the wind in whatever direction. And he concludes, sadly, "Commanded always but the greatest gust, such is the lightness of you common men." Early times of the reign of Henry VI that another historical and legendary character jumps on the scene, namely Joan of Arc. Given the strong nationalistic charge of Shakespeare plays, he follows the line whereby Joan of Arc was a cheap witch. However, as we know, Joan of Arc is an important reference point in the French national identity. Born to a family of farmers in the town of Domremy, today Domremy-la-Pucelle, inspired by mystic visions ever since she was 13 years old, she entered the service of the French King Charles VII and convinced him to send her to free the city of Orléans that had been under siege by the English for some time. In this miniature we see King Charles VII and his court, at the end at the lower right we see Joan of Arc, La Pucelle. According to history or legend, Joan of Arc succeeded in galvanizing the troops and freed the city from the English siege. Then she led the army to the city of Reims, where traditionally all French kings were crowned. And indeed, the earlier disenfranchised Charles VII was duly crowned King of France. But history, as you know, is never linear. In the Middle Ages, France was still subject to the domain of powerful feudal lords who occupied large tracts of land and were not necessarily faithful subjects of the king. The domain of Burgundy was a case at hand. While Joan of Arc was fighting under the walls of Compiègne, the Burgundians captured her and sold her to the English for 10,000 escutcheons, or sterling if you like. She was taken to the city of Rouen, where the local bishop organized a mock trial whose outcome was known in advance, and she was burned at the stake in 1431. A few decades later, under the Pope Callistus II, the trial was declared invalid, and then in the year 1900, Joan of Arc was made a saint and became, as you know, the patron saint of France. Back to England. Irrespective of the episode of Joan of Arc, the English during the reign of Henry VI lost all the possessions that Henry V had acquired in France. Eventually, in 1475, there was signed the Treaty of Picquigny between King Edward IV, who had usurped Henry VI's reign, and King Louis XI, called the Prudent, Louis XI the Prudent. To the English there remained in France only the city of Calais, which they held until 1558. Meanwhile, in England we are in the middle and at the end of that section of the 100-year war that can be properly called the War of the Roses. Henry VI was the last of the Lancastrian kings, the Red Rose Party, and after defeating the Lancastrian forces in Wales, Edward IV was crowned king in 1461. But now, in the endless complications of history, he became embroiled in a battle with an important character in the historical period and saga, the Earl of Warwick, which initially had helped Edward to the throne. But for various reasons, Edward IV and Warwick became enemies. However, eventually Edward IV regained the throne, and Henry VI was later murdered by the famous or infamous Richard III. But I'm running out of time, and I plan to leave Richard III for a next episode, where we will see the end of the War of the Roses and, in some way, the end of the Middle Ages, at least from the political point of view. In the context of the 100-year war, especially in the period when England lost in France all the possession previously gained by King Henry V, we find some other interesting characters. One mentionable character in this war was French Marshal Jules de Ré, who successfully fought the English with Joan of Arc. He retired to his castle Machecoul, where he practiced alchemy and all sorts of murders and infamies. He was eventually executed for witchcraft, but his name persisted in 3 languages as Barbe Bleue in French, Barbe Bleue in Italian, and Bluebeard in English, thanks to the novel by 17th century writer Charles Perrault. Anyway, the end of the hostilities gave way at large to what we call the sense of the nation, and thus came to an end the relationship of former subjection by the great feudal lords to the king. Feudalism continued until the French Revolution, but now it was an instrument of the state, as was the king himself. One final curiosity. At the onset of the 100-Year War, a treaty of alliance was signed between Edward III of England and Ferdinand I of Portugal. And this treaty was to be in perpetuity. And in 1943, Winston Churchill announced to the House of Commons that by virtue of this treaty, Great Britain had requested and obtained from the government of Lisbon the use of the Azore Islands during the final phase of the Second World War. For what is worth, I'm not a great admirer of Winston Churchill. Still, history is never simple and is full of surprises and complication. And as the character Rosalind says in As You Like It, how full of briars is a working day world. Thank you for watching, and until next time, I am Jimmy Moglia for Historical Sketches. Good night.